The Spectator magazine is home to wonderful writing, insightful analysis, and unrivaled books and arts reviews. Subscribe today for just £12 and receive a 12-week subscription in print and online, along with a free £20 John Lewis or Waitrose voucher. Go to spectator.co.uk/voucher.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots, the Spectator's daily politics podcast. I'm Patrick Gibbons and today I'm joined by the Spectator's political editor, Katy Balls, and the Spectator's deputy US editor, Kate Andrews. Kate, there have been some positive developments on UK and US trade, but just before we get into that, there was a lot of movement over the weekend around Trump's policy on tariffs, suggestions of exemptions, then suggestions the exemptions would be short-lived. What's the latest on that?
It's an interesting question, Patrick, because the divides within Team Trump, particularly within the cabinet, are becoming much more apparent. And it's far too early to say who's going to win. But you had the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, out over the weekend talking about how this pause really is just a pause and how you have a huge sweeping tariff regime coming the rest of the world's way. But it's been interesting to see that not impact markets too harshly, certainly nothing like what we saw in the week that Donald Trump first announced the tariffs. And I think that is because there's a real sense that the pro-tariff lobby within the cabinet had the ear of the president leading up to the announcement. And since the pivot, it is those who are either skeptical or just far more discerning about the use of tariffs who have the president's ear. And the person really leading that charge is the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who has changed his tune on tariffs, particularly when he was trying to get the job, but really did the heavy lifting, according to Wall Street Journal, a week ago when Donald Trump decided to pause these tariffs and change his mind because there was just so much chaos and there was so much fear and uncertainty. That battle is certainly going to play out over the next 90 days, not least because, the people who were really keen on the idea of tariffs, they see this as their shot, and they're probably right. This is a once in a multiple decade shot at completely overturning the global trade order and implementing far more protectionist measures. They're not going to give up without a fight. And already they've been quite successful in implementing a baseline 10% tariff on all imports. I mean, that is a fundamental change. We shouldn't act as if this pause means that there's no change. As you say, Patrick, Trump is talking about exemptions. He's talking about certain kinds of materials. He's talking about electronics. I mean, talk about picking winners and losers. This is a government that is acting in a very protectionist way. But what is clear is that market mayhem certainly got to Team Trump. And those who would be much more keen to negotiate and to find free trade deals and agreements with other nations do seem to be having a lot more influence in the past couple of days. And markets know it because this talk about unpausing the tariffs and, just going right back to where we were 10 days ago does not seem to have made them as nervous, certainly not nearly as they were when the president first announced them.
And Katy, just on trade deals, overnight we got the news that Vance had talked up the idea of a UK-US trade deal in comments made by the US Vice President to UnHerd. Vance said the US was working hard with Starmer's government and reiterated, as we know, that Trump loves the UK and the royal family. Has the trade deal just taken a step forward?
I think it potentially has. So these comments, as you say, to the sister publication of UnHerd have been picked up widely, and you've actually seen the markets rally a little in response, it seems, to those comments. I think reading between the lines, it's probably too hard to say this is a sign that a deal is about to happen. Now, it's been quite clear for the past couple of weeks that some in government on the UK side think a deal could be very close because the negotiations have been going on for such a long time and they were trying to do it around Liberation Day, as Donald Trump likes to call it. The question has more been, what is the US appetite to get this deal done, and where does the UK stand in the pecking order of other countries? And here, again, to Kate's point, you get mixed signals. At one point, it seemed as though their priority would be larger trading partners and also those who had harsher tariffs against them. It would be a priority to see, well, what are they going to offer in response? And those on the 10% rate would be, you're not in the worst position, so you can wait a little bit longer. Then the counter to that is Australia and the UK were seen as countries where a lot of the work had been done, so were quite simple, low-hanging fruit deals to do. I think when you look at the comments by JD Vance, he is saying, there's a good chance a trade deal could be reached. It would be easier to land than with other European countries due to a more reciprocal relationship. I mean, it's been quite clear for some time that the US administration believes there's a more reciprocal relationship with the EU. Look at the initial tariffs that were put in. The problem the UK has recently is Trump pulling back and watering down his plans to a degree has meant that the UK in a way lost its competitive advantage. The UK had a slightly sweeter spot, but then when other countries are subject to softer measures as a result of that, call it what you want, potential U-turn. All of a sudden, the UK is now with lots of other people in its treatment. So could this push over? I mean, I think the real issue is what are the main asks from the US of the UK in this trade deal? And we know that technology policy and tech is going to be a really key part of that. And that can stretch into the digital services tax, but also into the online safety bill. And at the moment, we don't have a sense of where America is on those specifics, or if they're going to be pushing for more to get to that. At the very least, this is not a bad thing for the government. It's obviously good when the vice president is speaking in a positive way. There are plenty more questions as to, what would get this to the final line.
Yeah, I mean, Kate, both you and Katy have mentioned, there's uncertainty around Donald Trump's position and the position within the administration. Will Labour be wary of talking this deal up?
They should be, because there's still so much that stands in the way of it. And as Katy says, they have been negotiating for a long time, and it's completely possible that 90, 92, 95% of a deal is done. But whatever hasn't been negotiated yet is the reason a free trade deal hasn't happened yet. And that is because there's some really sticky topics. Katy mentioned a couple of them, and I would also throw in agriculture. I mean, I think for the United States, this is going to be the really tricky thing. For the UK, would they be willing to revisit the digital services tax, which disproportionately affects American companies, but the government has really tripled down on? We don't know. Would America be willing to do a free trade deal that didn't involve agriculture, that didn't involve importing chicken and beef to the UK? That is going to be a really difficult question, not least because politicians in every party in the UK practically have spent years just terrifying the public about the quality of American food and American agriculture. So I think that remains really tough. And if we look at that interview that our friends at UnHerd did with JD Vance, I think it's very clear that the vice president is also almost deliberately walking a little bit of that line. I mean, he's making very clear that some of those comments about Europe do not fully reflect his view of Europe, which is very helpful and good for Europe to know. But there's also a strong indication there of, if you play by these new rules, if you don't retaliate with these tariffs, if you continue to act as a friend, even when we're being a bit more difficult, then we can discuss free trade. There are conditions on this. This isn't just, we love the UK. We're big fans of European history. This is something else entirely. And it's definitely more friendly than the vice president's been in a long time. So there's good reason for Europe to be optimistic, and particularly the UK, as it was singled out. And UnHerd asked specifically about a free trade deal. But there's still a lot of caveats to that. So we shouldn't get too ahead of ourselves. I mean, how incredible would it be if next week they announced even a bare bones free trade deal? That would be something. But if they're really going to get into tech and they're going to get into food, then I would expect a much longer negotiation.
And I think adding to that, for all the sense that Donald Trump is an Anglophile, that he loves the royal family, I think that the UK government would potentially argue, at least privately, they haven't felt all that warmth so far. They might have felt less of a chill than some other countries, but it hasn't felt like a warm embrace as they've been, caught in the middle of a trade war.
And just here domestically, Katy, the local elections campaign continues, and I believe Nigel Farage has been out giving a stump speech.
You've had Nigel Farage speaking in Durham of a campaign speech, and I think this is part of reform's efforts, particularly in the local elections, to try and pick up votes in traditional Labour heartlands. Something I wrote about in the magazine, which will be out on Thursday, I believe. We're just on early Easter deadlines. And I think, again, you think about Durham as the history of mining and so forth. This also, I think, feeds into one of Reform's themes when they're trying to take the fight to Labour, which is about industrialisation. And if you look at, the nationalisation of steel over the weekend, there is a feeling that if Labour look as though they have abandoned those voters or decisions that the government has made related to net zero, takeovers and so forth, then Reform can position itself as the natural step to go. In response, you have Labour spending a lot more time thinking about how to take the fight to Reform. And I think one of the things they're keen to do is, you've already had this idea that they keep trying to push about Nigel Farage and the NHS, and picking up previous comments saying, oh, he'll try and charge you money to get your hip replaced and so forth. I think the other thing they're really going to try and do is associate Nigel Farage with the Tory party, and this idea with an electoral pact. These rumours that you might think Reform for a Labour voter is palatable, but look at the Tories who want to do a deal with Nigel Farage, and he could actually usher them through the back door. So I think we'll be seeing more of that.
Do you think it'll work? Do you think they'll be able to associate him with the Tories?
I think it depends. I mean, I personally think that Nigel Farage enough of a personality in of himself, and he's been gone for the Tories so much that I think that it's hard to say he is in bed with the Tories. Of course, if an electoral pact starts to feel like it is going to become more of a thing, and for example, there are plans to have a campaign launch, I think quite soon after the local elections, with figures involved, not elected politicians, but figures involved, Reform in the past and so forth, and some of the Tories saying we need to start working out how we're going to work together. I think if it starts to feel as though they really are working together and there's plans for some Tory Reform coalition, then maybe you do start to look a bit more associated. But that's also the reason why Reform want to stay so far away from that, because I think it's more politically toxic for Reform to be associated with the Tories than it is for the Tories to be associated with Reform.
How times have changed.
What do you think, Kate?
I think it would be tricky. I mean, for all the reasons you just laid out, it's absolutely possible, especially if the Tories really start bigging up that they'd like to do a deal with Reform, because you could have quotes that you can share that don't have to be from Reform. But I mean, Nigel Farage just feels like the Tories' public enemy number one right now. I think it's going to be very difficult to paint him, in all blue. But exciting times indeed.
Well, just over 2 weeks to go. We shall see. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Katy. And thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.